Imagine this. You're on a luxury cruise ship, the Riviera, sailing peacefully across the sea. The weather is calm, the music is soft, and everyone on board is preparing for what was supposed to be one of the highlights of the journey, docking in Shanghai on October 15th. People are excited. Some have already booked tours, shopping plans, restaurant reservations. The ship is only 48 nautical miles away from the port, less than a 2-hour sail. And then suddenly, everything changes. Without warning, the ship turns. The direction shifts on the navigation screens. Confusion spreads across the decks. Staff begin making announcements that don't explain much, only that the ship will no longer be stopping in China. Instead, the new destination is Busan, South Korea. More than 1,250 passengers are left shocked and frustrated. Some demand refunds. Others are simply stunned. After all, how could a cruise just skip a major destination at the last minute? But the reason is even more surprising. If the Riviera had continued to Shanghai, the cruise company would have been forced to pay a port fee of around $1.6 million, just to dock the ship for that one visit. That single fee alone would have wiped out nearly all the profit from the route. So the company made a choice: change course, save the money, and deal with the backlash. What seemed like a travel inconvenience on the surface was actually the result of something much bigger, a trade conflict between two global powers. And this cruise ship was just caught in the middle of it. This is where our story begins. To understand why a cruise ship suddenly had to reroute, we need to take a step back and look at something called Section 301. It sounds like a boring legal code, but it has become one of the most powerful weapons in America's trade strategy. Section 301 is part of a United States trade law from 1974. In simple terms, it gives the U.S. government the authority to punish another country if it believes that country is engaging in unfair trade practices. And the punishment usually comes in the form of tariffs, basically extra taxes added to goods when they enter the United States. Now here's where things get more serious. When Donald Trump took office, he didn't just use Section 301, he turned it into a key tool of his global trade strategy. Instead of negotiating quietly behind closed doors, he used tariffs like pressure points. The message was simple: if you don't play by our rules, we make your exports more expensive. China, being one of the world's largest export nations, especially in manufacturing, became one of his biggest targets. At first, the U.S. added a 10% tariff on certain Chinese goods. But that didn't stay small for long. That tariff was pushed much higher, in some cases reaching over 100%. Imagine buying something at a store and suddenly the price doubles. That's what these tariffs do when Chinese goods arrive at American ports. And because about 95% of U.S.-China trade moves across the ocean, Section 301 didn't just affect factories. It directly impacted shipping, shipbuilding, and port operations. That is how a law written 50 years ago ended up influencing where modern cruise ships can dock. So now, China is responding in its own way. And that response is exactly what forced the Riviera to change course. Now that we understand the background, here's the key move that set everything into motion. On October 14th, China introduced a new special port fee aimed specifically at certain ships connected to the United States. This wasn't random. It was designed as a direct response to the U.S. Section 301 actions. So what does this new rule say? It states that any ship that is owned by a U.S. company, operated by a U.S. company, built in the U.S., flying a U.S. flag, or even a ship where Americans own at least 25% of the company that controls it, must pay a special port fee to dock in China. This means it doesn't matter where the ship is sailing from. If the ownership or origins have strong U.S. ties, the fee applies. And that fee is not small. Starting rate, October 14th, 2025, is $56 per ton. Planned increase by April 2028, up to $157 per ton. For a large passenger cruise ship or a massive container vessel, this turns into hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars just to touch a Chinese port. That is exactly what happened with the Riviera. Based on its size and tonnage, docking in Shanghai would have meant paying around $1.6 million for one stop. But China didn't make this an all-or-nothing rule. There are exemptions. If a ship was built in China, it can avoid the fee. If a ship enters a Chinese shipyard for repairs while carrying no cargo, it can be exempt. And, in special cases, China can approve an exemption if the ship is mainly serving the Chinese domestic tourism market, something that came into play in a later example we'll discuss. So in simple terms, the U.S. raised trade pressure. China responded by targeting the ships that physically bring U.S. goods and companies to China. This brings us to the real-world fallout, the companies and vessels that had to react instantly to this new rule. This is where the policy stopped being just numbers on paper and started affecting real people, real ships, and real decisions. We'll start with the ship we opened with, the Riviera, forced to turn away. The Riviera was already on its way to Shanghai. Passengers had Shanghai printed clearly in their travel booklets. Shore excursions were booked. Some passengers even packed specifically for that stop, family visits, business meetings, sightseeing plans. Then suddenly, just 48 nautical miles away, the captain made an announcement. Due to new port fee regulations, we will not be calling in Shanghai. Instead, the ship veered north to Busan, South Korea. Why? Because docking in Shanghai under the new fees would have cost around $1.64 million for that single visit. It wasn't just confusing, it was emotional. People who had waited months for this itinerary were now standing on the deck, staring at the horizon where Shanghai was supposed to be. You could say the policy changed a city visit, but really it changed the entire experience, and for some, the meaning of their trip. Cargo ships were hit too. The tanker Manuka, which had already docked in Ningbo, received a surprise invoice after the new policy went into effect. The bill? About $630,000. No negotiation, no grace period. Just a bill that instantly turned a profitable voyage into a loss. Imagine running a business, and one port visit wipes out your margin for the quarter. Within weeks, several cargo carriers canceled planned port calls in Ningbo and Shanghai. Many began diverting instead to Busan in South Korea, Kaohsiung in Taiwan, and even Singapore. Here's the problem. Ships could unload in Busan, but the cargo still needed to reach China, which meant extra trucking and rail transport, adding cost, time, and complications for both exporters and importers. Then there was the corporate side, companies trying to dodge the fee without rerouting. Take eco-tankers. Just weeks before the fee went into effect, several board members with U.S. citizenship or U.S. residency resigned. Why? Because changing leadership structure could allow the company to argue that it was no longer U.S.-owned under the new rules. This is how far-reaching the policy became. Not just ships changing course, but companies changing their leadership to avoid costs. One cruise ship didn't face the fee spectrum of the seas. Even though it carries many international passengers, it sails under the Bahamas flag, was built in Germany, and its passenger list was mostly Chinese travelers. Because of that, it was classified more as part of China's domestic tourism market than an American-linked vessel. So it was exempt. This shows something important. China's policy wasn't just about money. It was about strategic leverage. Now we've seen how ships and companies had to react in real time. The next question is, what happened to the global shipping system as a whole? Because rerouted ships and corporate resignations don't happen in isolation. Once ships began rerouting and companies started avoiding Chinese ports, the real-world complications set in almost immediately. This wasn't just a matter of changing a map route. It reshaped the entire flow of goods. Let's break down the practical consequences. If a ship can't dock in China, many now stop in Busan, South Korea instead. But China is still where the goods need to go. So the cargo has to be unloaded in Busan, moved to warehouses, loaded onto trains or trucks, and sent across the sea or land to China. Every step adds time, labor, fuel, and handling fees. One shipment that used to take one port stop now requires 3 to 5 extra stages. In shipping, this isn't just inconvenient, it breaks contracts. Most shipping deals are priced months in advance based on a known route and known costs. But when the Riviera, the Manuka, and dozens of cargo ships had to reroute, the old contracts didn't match the new expenses. Someone had to eat the extra cost. Many companies faced a no-win choice. Raise prices on customers or absorb the hit and lose profit. Neither is good for business. When one port changes, the effects ripple. Warehouses that expected shipments on Tuesday now receive them on Friday. Factories waiting for parts stop production lines. Retailers delay product launches or deliveries. Even a 3-day delay in global shipping can snowball into weeks of slowdowns across industries. There's another layer most people don't think about. The same trade tensions also restrict access to U.S.-made equipment used in shipbuilding. Shipyards in Asia reported delays of 3 to 6 months because U.S. parts were harder to purchase. Export approvals were slowed, and component prices rose sharply. This means fewer new ships enter service, which increases pressure on the shipping market long term. One of the clearest signals from your transcript was this shift. Previously, around 15% of new shipbuilding orders in the region came from companies connected to the U.S. After the fee and related trade measures, that dropped to under 5%. In global shipping, this is a massive realignment. Shipyards rely on years-long order pipelines. Losing customers now affects jobs and capacity for years into the future. So in the short term, we saw higher transport costs, contract disputes, supply chain delays, shipyard slowdowns, and declining orders, all happening at the same time. But the real question is, so who actually pays for all of this? Well, it's not just the shipping companies, and it's not just the governments either. In the end, the costs eventually reach ordinary people. Up to now, we've been talking mostly about ships, ports, and companies. But honestly, the real impact of trade retaliation is much bigger. And eventually, it lands on ordinary people. Let's zoom out for a second and look at what the data in your notes shows happened after the new port fees took effect. First, trade volumes dropped, and they dropped fast. In May 2025, U.S. imports from China fell by about 20.8% compared to April. That's not a slow reduction, that's a cliff. And when fewer ships arrive with goods, U.S. ports feel it right away. You highlighted 2 examples. At the Port of Oakland, ship calls were down 83%. At the Port of Los Angeles, ship calls dropped by 71%. When ports go quiet, dock workers lose shifts, truck drivers lose routes, and local businesses, like coffee shops, diners, equipment suppliers, and repair yards, lose customers. Port economies are ecosystems, and when one piece slows, everything slows. Second, U.S. ports are losing billions. Economists estimate that U.S. ports are set to lose around $3 billion in just the first year of this retaliation cycle alone. And it's not because they did anything wrong, it's simply because less cargo is coming in. And remember, port revenue isn't just for port owners. It funds city budgets, infrastructure projects, local schools, fire departments, and public services. So, the ripple spreads far beyond the docks. Third, consumers feel it in prices. When shipping gets more expensive, the cost doesn't just stay at sea, it moves into retail prices, construction materials, electronics, food shipments, and everyday household items. A journey that used to cost $6,000 per container might now cost $8,000 or more after rerouting, storage, and extra transport. Even if each product only goes up by, say, 10 cents, 50 cents, or $2, when you multiply that by millions of products, you get the picture. Now, grocery bills rise, hardware store prices go up, and online shopping costs more at checkout. People feel it, whether they've ever heard the term Section 301 or not. And finally, the trade war becomes a mirror. One of the clearest insights from your transcript was the conclusion: there are no real winners here. The US tried to pressure China with tariffs. China countered by making it costly for US-linked ships to enter its ports. Both sides hit the other's industries, but both sides also hit their own economies in the process. Workers, passengers, small businesses, and consumers are caught in the middle of a game they didn't choose. This is the human cost of trade policy. So now we've covered the ships, the companies, the supply chains, and the economic fallout. The last major question is why? Why did China respond this way? And what does it hope to achieve? By now, it's pretty clear this wasn't just about a cruise ship missing a port call or a few shipping companies paying more. This was a strategic move in a much larger contest between two global powers. To understand China's decision, we need to look at leverage. First, China's retaliation was targeted, not random. The US used Section 301 to raise tariffs and restrict technology access, directly pressuring China's export and manufacturing economy. So China responded by targeting something the US is highly dependent on: shipping access. Just remember, China is connected to over 700 ports worldwide. About 31% of global seaborne exports passed through Chinese ports in 2024. And China is the world's largest shipbuilding hub. In other words, China sits at the center of global maritime logistics. By raising port fees on US-linked vessels, China wasn't just making shipping more expensive. It was reminding the world just how essential its port network is. Second, this move signals a shift in how countries use power. Trade wars used to mean raising tariffs, setting quotas, or restricting imports. Now the tools are becoming port access, ownership rules, shipbuilding incentives, transit fees, and logistics choke points. This is economic influence applied to transportation, not just goods. It's kind of like saying, we don't need to stop your products themselves. We can just make it harder for your products to arrive. Third, companies are already adapting. The fallout isn't happening in the future, it's happening right now. Companies are changing where they register their ships, moving board seats to avoid US classification, rerouting supply chains through South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, and shifting long-term shipbuilding orders away from China. That means new trade corridors will form, some Asian ports will grow stronger, and others may lose influence. This isn't temporary. This is structural change in how global shipping operates. So, what happens next? Well, there are three possible scenarios. Scenario A, continued escalation. Both sides add more restrictions, costs rise, supply chains slow, and honestly, consumers pay more. No one wins, but neither side backs down. Scenario B, quiet negotiation. Diplomats work behind the scenes. Fees are reduced, exemptions expand, and the system stabilizes. But, trust remains damaged. Then there's Scenario C. Companies adapt permanently. Businesses redesign supply chains to avoid relying heavily on any single country. This creates a more expensive but more diversified global market. Right now, we're actually somewhere between Scenario A and Scenario C. The key insight here is that this wasn't just about a fee. It was about who controls the choke points of global trade. Tariffs affect prices, port fees affect movement, and movement, in global shipping, is everything. Let's bring this story back to where it started. A cruise ship, the Riviera, floating just shy of Shanghai. Passengers lined along the railings, expecting to see one of the world's most iconic skylines. Instead, the ship turned. Quietly. Suddenly. Without warning. To those passengers, it felt personal, confusing, frustrating, even disappointing. But what they experienced wasn't a navigation error. It was the result of trade policy, a decision made in government offices thousands of miles away. This is the real point. When governments use tariffs, port fees, and trade restrictions as tools of pressure, it's not presidents or CEOs who feel it first. It's dock workers who lose shifts. It's exporters who lose contracts. It's families whose groceries cost more. It's passengers whose dream trips change mid-ocean. Trade policy isn't abstract. It's not just speeches and headlines. It's people's plans, jobs, and incomes. And why does this matter? Because this won't be the last time trade is used as leverage. The world is entering a phase where ports become negotiating chips, ships become pressure points, and supply chains become strategic battlegrounds. These policies are shaping the price of goods, the routes ships take, and even how companies structure themselves. The story of the Riviera is just one example, but the effects ripple far beyond that ship. So here's the takeaway. When nations fight with tariffs and port fees, the shockwaves don't hit governments first. They hit the people on board, the travelers, the workers, the consumers, the businesses just trying to stay afloat. And that's why this story matters. If this helped you understand the human side of global trade, hit the like button. It really supports the channel. Subscribe if you want more clear explanations of global events like this. No jargon, no fluff. And tell me in the comments, which part surprised you most? The Riviera's last-minute turn? The $1.6 million docking fee? Or the fact that board members resigned to avoid being US-owned? I read every comment, and I want to hear what you noticed.